They called my warnings quaint, the ramblings of a man too long alone with his water, his trees, his ancestral stretch of undeveloped shoreline. Preston Holloway, president of the newly formed Waterside Estates Homeowners Association, a man whose tailored suits never quite hid the cheap ambition glinting in his eyes, had smirked when I presented him with my grandfather's journals, detailed chronicles of the lake's moods, its seasonal swell, the immutable truth of the watershed that fed its depths. He'd patted the glossy brochure for their 25 luxury lakeside homes, their foundations practically staked out on what any fool with a history of this land would know was ephemeral floodplain. "Mr. Henderson," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have engineers, surveyors, state-of-the-art hydrological models. Progress, you understand. Progress." He used the word like a cudgel. They wanted to build their prefabricated paradise directly across my pristine lake, on a tract they'd acquired through some typically opaque county deal. They didn't know the water, not really. They saw a placid surface, a marketable amenity. I saw a living entity, its breath tied to the skies, its temper a thing of raw, untamable power. They certainly didn't know the rain season, not the way my blood and bones knew it, and they had absolutely no inkling that my quiet observation was not passivity, but the cold, patient gathering of evidence. They were trespassers, not just on land, but against sense, against the very rhythm of this place. Their first act of aggression was a notice, slipped under my door, suggesting a beautification initiative that required me to clear a 50-foot swath of my overgrown shoreline to enhance the view for their future residents. My land, my view. My trees, planted by my father. The audacity was breathtaking, a prelude to the larger violation to come. Holloway even had the gall to imply my uncooperative stance might affect property values, mine, of course, being the problematic one. He spoke of community, but his eyes spoke only of control. He didn't know I held the original surveyor's maps, the ones that showed the historical high water mark, a mark that lapped dangerously close to where their architectural monstrosities were planned. He didn't know I was a retired hydrologist, one who'd spent 30 years predicting water's brutal, indifferent force for governments that, unlike him, occasionally listened. He simply saw an old man, a relic, an obstacle to be swept aside by the tide of his own self-importance. And so, the bulldozers arrived. Their diesel growl a profanity in the morning, quiet, tearing into the earth that I knew, with absolute certainty, was borrowed time. The moral violation wasn't just the noise, the dust, the arrogant scarring of the landscape. It was the deliberate deafness, the willful ignorance. I'd sent Holloway certified letters, complete with notarized copies of floodplain maps, historical rainfall data meticulously compiled over decades, even newspaper clippings from '78, when the old mill downstream was submerged after a particularly relentless rain season. Each communication was met with a form letter response, citing their comprehensive environmental impact studies. Studies I later discovered were conducted during the driest spell in 20 years by a firm with suspiciously close ties to Holloway's development company. They were building coffins and calling them homes. The concrete slabs went down, stark gray squares on the wounded earth. Then the framing, skeletal structures rising against the tree line, an affront to the natural curve of the shore. I watched them from my porch, through binoculars, my old Labrador sighing at my feet as if he too felt the wrongness of it all. Each nail hammered was a tick of a clock only I seemed to hear. My family had stewarded this lake, this small parcel of my land, for 3 generations. It wasn't about ownership in the paper deed sense. It was about custodianship, a solemn promise to respect its wildness. Holloway and his HOA were violating that covenant with every truckload of lumber, every smug assurance to their eager buyers that these were premium waterfront properties. The term waterfront would, I suspected, soon take on a far more literal, and ruinous meaning. They were not merely building homes, they were erecting monuments to their own avarice, gambling with the lives and savings of people drawn in by glossy lies and the promise of an idyllic life by the lake. A lake whose true nature was being deliberately concealed. My daughter, Sarah, a sharp-witted environmental lawyer in the city, had reviewed their plans. "Dad," she'd said, her voice tight with professional anger, "their drainage plans are a joke. They're basically relying on your side of the lake to act as a giant spillway. It's negligent, bordering on criminal." She offered to draft a cease and desist, to explore injunctions. I told her to wait, to document. Holloway had already dismissed my concerns as the ramblings of a local eccentric. A legal challenge from me, directly, at that stage, he'd painted as NIMBYism, sour grapes. No, my strategy was different. It was colder, more patient. I was gathering the rope they would eventually use to hang themselves. The line had been crossed when the first shovel hit that vulnerable earth. The moral transgression was complete. All that remained was the inevitable, natural consequence, a reckoning that no amount of modern engineering or arrogant bluster could forestall when the true rain season arrived. The water level would rise, as it always did. The swamp they were unknowingly cultivating would bloom. My retaliation was one of patient observation, of meticulous, silent record-keeping. Every morning I took photographs. Timestamps, weather conditions, the precise stage of construction for each of the 25 doomed homes. I had a drone, a quiet little eye in the sky I'd bought years ago for surveying my own property lines and checking for storm damage on my roof. Now, it became my silent witness. It drifted over their burgeoning neighborhood, recording their folly with cold, digital precision. The footage was damning. Crews working in areas clearly marked as wetlands on older county maps, drainage ditches that seemed to lead nowhere useful, foundations poured at elevations that made my teeth ache with vicarious dread. I cross-referenced their progress with historical water level charts for my lake, superimposing projected flood lines onto their site plans. The result was always the same: inundation. Catastrophic, predictable inundation. My sidekick in this grim theater was old Martha Periwinkle, a retired librarian with a penchant for local history and an almost unsettlingly accurate memory for town council scandals. She'd unearthed zoning variances granted under dubious circumstances, minutes from planning meetings where concerns about water runoff were summarily dismissed, usually after a generous contribution from Holloway's development group to some local initiative. Martha, bless her conspiracy theorist heart, saw corruption where I saw mostly hubris and incompetence. But her research provided a rich tapestry of civic malfeasance that beautifully complemented my hydrological data. We met weekly, ostensibly for tea and biscuits, but really to compare notes, our own quiet war room sessions. She'd bring photocopied documents. I'd show her drone footage. "They're digging their own watery graves. The blithering idiots," she'd cackle, adjusting her spectacles. I even had a quiet chat with Deputy Miller, a young officer who'd grown up fishing this very lake. He listened, his face grim, when I laid out the historical data. "Legally, Mr. Henderson," he'd said, "my hands are tied until there's an actual event. But I've logged your concerns. Officially." He was a reluctant authority, hamstrung by bureaucracy, but sympathetic. His official logging of my concerns was another small, precisely placed stone in the foundation of their future ruin. The dry season was drawing to a close. The air grew heavier. The skies began to brood. The construction across the lake neared completion. A row of pastel-colored boxes, their new lawns a vibrant, unnatural green. They were selling fast. Holloway was a peacock, strutting at open houses, promising serenity. I just waited. My preparations were complete. The evidence was catalogued, secured, duplicated. My conscience was clear. I hadn't wished this upon them. I had merely refused to shield them from the consequences of their own breathtaking arrogance. The lake itself would be the enforcer. The first rains were gentle, almost apologetic, a soft drumming on the roof that barely disturbed the late summer quiet. Holloway probably saw them as a blessing, settling the dust on his newly paved roads, nurturing the sod his landscapers had hastily rolled out. For a week, it was intermittent. A shower, then sun, then another shower. The water level in the lake crept up, slowly, almost imperceptibly to the untrained eye. I noted it in my log, +3 inches, +5. The ground around their new homes, already low-lying, began to look perpetually damp. Small puddles formed in the swales between houses, refusing to drain. Then, the sky opened. It wasn't a storm, not in the dramatic sense of thunder and lightning. It was just rain. Relentless, soaking monsoonal rain, the kind that defined our true rain season. Day after day, the clouds hung low and gray, a weeping ceiling that refused to lift. The drumming on my roof became a constant roar. The lake, my beautiful placid lake, began to transform. It swelled, its edges blurring, creeping inland. The vibrant green lawns across the water started to soften, then darken, as the water table rose from beneath, meeting the deluge from above. I watched, often from my covered porch, a mug of coffee steaming in my hands. There was no satisfaction, not yet, only a grim affirmation of what I knew to be true. The news channels started talking about localized flooding in low-lying areas across the county. Holloway's development, Waterside Estates, hadn't made the news yet, but I could see it. The carefully constructed berms, laughably inadequate, were breached first. Water, muddy and insistent, began to pool around the foundations of the homes closest to the original waterline. Then it wasn't just pooling, it was sheeting, flowing. The brand new asphalt roads became shallow canals. I saw a couple of residents, new arrivals, out in yellow slickers, trying to dig futile trenches with garden spades. Their faces, even from a distance, were masks of disbelief, then dawning horror. Holloway himself made an appearance, his expensive SUV struggling through the nascent swamp. He gesticulated wildly, his voice lost to the wind and rain, probably still trying to sell them on the temporary inconvenience of it all. The water level in my lake was now 3 feet above its dry season norm, and climbing. The rain showed no sign of abating. The meticulous calculations, the historical precedents, the ignored warnings, they were all converging into a devastating liquid reality for the unfortunate souls who had believed the promises of a charlatan. The neighborhood was visibly sinking. The transformation was complete within another 48 hours of ceaseless rain. Waterside Estates was no longer a neighborhood. It was a swamp, a dismal archipelago of partially submerged homes. The water level had risen a catastrophic 5 feet, just as my grandfather's journals and my own calculations had predicted for a rain season of this intensity. My lake now extended its gray, unforgiving embrace deep into their meticulously planned community. Lawns were gone, replaced by murky water reflecting the grim sky. Driveways disappeared into the sludge. The lower floors of at least 15 of the 25 homes were visibly flooded, water lapping against windowsills, creeping up interior walls. For the remaining 10, their foundations were islands in a stagnant morass, their access roads impassable. The brand new, vibrant landscaping, the ornamental shrubs, the sapling trees, were drowned, pathetic sticks poking from the mire. It was a scene of quiet, comprehensive devastation. From my vantage point, it looked like a child's model village, carelessly left out in a deluge. There was a terrible, still beauty to it, the kind of beauty that accompanies absolute ruin. The premium waterfront properties now had water in them, through them. The lake had reclaimed its territory. My drone, buzzing discreetly on a brief pause in the downpour, captured the full extent. The geometric precision of their layout was now a cruel joke. streets transformed into muddy channels, cul-de-sacs into stagnant ponds. I saw inflatable rafts pulled up to front porches, sandbags pathetically breached. The faces of the few residents I could see were etched with despair and a dawning, furious betrayal. Holloway, I heard later, had tried to rent industrial pumps, but there was nowhere to pump the water to. The entire area was saturated, the natural drainage overwhelmed, just as I knew it would be. His engineers, his state-of-the-art models, had failed to account for one simple, ancient truth: water always wins when you disrespect its power. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match across the water. My revenge was silent, cold, and delivered by the relentless, uncaring hand of nature, aided and abetted by their own monumental arrogance. The tactical retaliation was complete, not by my hand, but by the inevitable consequence of their actions. A consequence I had simply foreseen and documented with surgical precision. The calls would begin soon, I knew. The desperate pleas for help, the recriminations, the search for someone to blame. They would find him, eventually. And they would find my warnings, pristine and prophetic. The rising water level hadn't just flooded their homes, it had washed away every lie Holloway had ever told. The aftermath was a slow, agonizing decay for waterside estates. As the rain finally subsided and the lake began its reluctant retreat, it left behind a scene of utter desolation. The flooded homes were ravaged, their interiors ruined by mud, mildew, and contaminated water. Walls were stained, floors buckled, appliances destroyed. The neighborhood didn't just look like a swamp, it smelled like one. A fetid miasma of decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and shattered dreams. Holloway, predictably, tried to deflect. He blamed unprecedented rainfall, an act of God, anything but his own catastrophic misjudgment and greed. He even had the temerity to suggest in an early, flustered press statement that the county's outdated drainage infrastructure was at fault, conveniently ignoring the fact that his development had created its own isolated hydrological disaster. But the tide of public opinion, much like the lake water, was turning against him. My carefully compiled dossier, the historical data, the ignored warnings, the drone footage of questionable construction practices, Martha's research into the shady zoning variances, found its way, anonymously at first, to a tenacious investigative reporter at the county paper, then to a regional news outlet. The story exploded. Paradise drowned. How developer greed turned dream homes into a toxic swamp. Headlines screamed of negligence, of warnings unheeded. Distraught homeowners, their life savings dissolving in the muck, gave tearful interviews, waving copies of Holloway's glossy brochures, promising secure, idyllic lakeside living. The contrast was brutal, compelling. The silent majority of other nearby residents, those in older, more sensibly sited developments, were initially sympathetic, then outraged as the full scope of Holloway's recklessness came to light. Realizing how his folly could impact the entire area's reputation and environment, Deputy Miller, true to his word, presented his official log of my prior warnings to his superiors, which then became part of the official county inquiry. The visual of those 25 homes, half submerged or marooned in a fetid swamp, became the defining image of corporate malfeasance. The water level had receded, but the swamp remained, a stubborn testament to their folly. The ground was too saturated, the natural drainage patterns too thoroughly disrupted by their ill-conceived earthworks. Their neighborhood was, for all intents and purposes, a permanent wetland now, a monument to hubris. The public reckoning was swift and merciless, a legal and financial maelstrom that consumed Holloway and his waterside estate's HOA. The first lawsuit was a class action, filed by the devastated homeowners, alleging gross negligence, fraudulent misrepresentation, and a litany of construction defects. My daughter, Sarah, wasn't directly involved. A conflict of interest, she dryly noted, but she connected the homeowners with a bulldog of a litigator who specialized in developer malfeasance. My documented warnings, the drone footage, Martha Periwinkle's meticulously gathered evidence of backroom deals and bypassed regulations, all became Exhibit A. The county, facing its own potential liability for approving such a demonstrably flawed project, launched its own investigation. Heads began to roll in the planning department. The state-of-the-art hydrological models Holloway had boasted of were revealed to be cursory. Cherry-picked reports that conveniently ignored worst-case scenarios and historical flood data for my lake. His engineers were found to have cut corners, their drainage solutions a cynical exercise in minimal compliance designed for a 50-year flood event, not the 100-year event that the topography and history clearly indicated was a recurring threat, especially during a severe rain season. The local news ran a week-long special, Secrets of the Swamp, featuring slow zooms on my warning letters, juxtaposed with images of the flooded homes. They even interviewed a visibly uncomfortable county commissioner who had championed the development. His stammering defense was a masterclass in political evasion, but the damage was done. Holloway's carefully constructed facade shattered. He became a pariah, his name synonymous with disaster. The HOA, bankrupt and leaderless after Holloway's unceremonious resignation, just before the indictments for fraud were handed down, dissolved. The 25 homes, unsellable, unlivable, became a collection of decaying monuments to greed. Some were eventually condemned, others simply abandoned to the creeping vegetation and the inexorable pull of the swamp they now inhabited. The insurance companies, citing gross negligence and pre-existing, undisclosed risks, namely the propensity of the area to become a swamp, denied most of the claims, leaving the homeowners financially ruined and emotionally broken. It was a tragedy, born of arrogance and deceit. My role was that of a prophet whose warnings were ignored, whose vindication was as cold and damp as the earth under those ruined houses. The tactical precision of allowing their own folly to be their undoing was complete. The visual metaphor was stark. The once proud sign for waterside estates now tilted precariously, half submerged in stagnant water, its lettering peeling, a perfect epitaph. The public humiliation of Preston Holloway was a spectacle of almost biblical proportions. He faced multiple fraud charges, both civil and criminal. His assets were frozen. His smug, tailored suits were replaced by ill-fitting, off-the-rack numbers for court appearances. The media hounded him, his face a permanent fixture on the local news, no longer the confident developer, but a haggard, broken man. The climactic confrontation wasn't a dramatic showdown with me, but his utter evisceration in the court of public opinion, and then in actual court. His attempts to shift blame, to paint himself as a victim of unforeseen circumstances, were shredded by the relentless weight of evidence, my evidence, Martha's evidence, the evidence of the ruined landscape itself. The drone footage, played on a large screen in the courtroom during one of the civil trials, was particularly devastating. The clear, unimpassioned aerial views of their construction directly on historical wetlands, the obviously inadequate drainage, the relentless rise of the water level systematically engulfing their project. It was a silent, damning narrator. My own testimony, when I was eventually called, was brief, factual, delivered with a cold, almost surgical precision. I presented my grandfather's journals, my own logs, the certified letters. I spoke of the lake's history, its immutable patterns. I didn't need to raise my voice. The facts screamed loud enough. The legal ally, in this case the prosecuting attorney and the homeowners' counsel, used my information like a scalpel, dissecting Holloway's defense layer by layer. The local corruption ties Martha had sniffed out also began to unravel, leading to a wider inquiry into the county's planning and zoning practices. It turned out Holloway's generous contributions had indeed greased palms, fast-tracking approvals and silencing dissenters within the bureaucracy. His empire, built on a foundation of deceit and quicksand, crumbled utterly. The neighbors, the silent majority, who had initially watched with detached curiosity, became a vocal chorus, demanding accountability, their own property values now threatened by the blight across the water. They attended town meetings, wrote letters, their initial passivity replaced by a protective fury for their own community. The entire saga served as a harsh lesson in due diligence, not just for prospective homebuyers, but for the entire county. The name Holloway became a local curse word, a synonym for disastrous hubris. His legacy wasn't luxury homes, but a man-made swamp and a pile of lawsuits. The lake, my lake, eventually settled back to its normal levels for that time of year, though the ground on the far shore remained saturated, a soggy testament. The Waterside Estates neighborhood, however, was irrevocably changed. It was a ghost town, a modern ruin. Nature, with a grim efficiency, began to reclaim it. Reeds and cattails sprouted in what were once manicured lawns. The stagnant water in the undrained depressions bred mosquitoes and frogs, their chorus a nightly dirge for the failed development. The pristine image Holloway had sold was replaced by a tableau of decay and neglect. There was a somber resilience in the air, the quiet dignity of a natural order reasserting itself after a violent disruption. My family legacy, the stewardship of this small piece of wilderness, felt vindicated, not through any active malice on my part, but through the simple, unwavering truth of the land itself. I had merely been its chronicler, its witness. The moral cost of their actions was laid bare for all to see, not just financial ruin, but the desecration of a landscape, the shattering of trust, the arrogant dismissal of wisdom. The fence they had metaphorically tried to erect around my way of life, their attempts to encroach and control, had been washed away. My porch light, a steady beacon throughout the ordeal, now shone across the water onto a scene of profound desolation, a constant reminder of the price of their folly. The locked gate of my own property felt more symbolic than ever, a boundary not just of land but of sense and respect, a boundary they had catastrophically failed to observe. The new reality was a stark one. 25 derelict structures slowly sinking into a man-made swamp, a permanent scar, but also a permanent lesson. Sometimes, the most potent revenge is to simply step back and allow your adversaries to be consumed by the full weight of their own stupidity. The water level had done its work, and the land remembered. My surveillance was no longer needed. The evidence was now irrefutable, etched into the very fabric of the ruined neighborhood. The tactical operation was over. My quiet life by the lake resumed, though the view across the water was forever altered. It was a constant, chilling reminder of the drama that had unfolded, a visual testament to the cold, calculated vengeance of an ignored truth. The skeletons of those 25 homes across the water, slowly surrendering to the swamp they had become, were a daily affirmation. The blood, in this war, was purely financial and reputational, but the wounds were mortal for Holloway and his enterprise. The local corruption, exposed like a network of diseased roots, was being painstakingly addressed by a newly cautious county council. The news headlines eventually faded, replaced by other dramas, but the physical evidence of their catastrophic failure remained. My porch light still cut through the darkness, a small point of unwavering stability in a landscape that had witnessed such profound upheaval. The psychological closure was immense. It wasn't triumph I felt, but a grim, quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from seeing a natural law, long defied, finally assert itself with undeniable force. The luxury waterfront they'd promised had materialized, just not in the way they'd marketed. Every single one of those homes now had an intimate, destructive relationship with the water. The rain season would come again, year after year. The water level would rise. The swamp would remain their enduring legacy. I sometimes walked my shoreline, my old Labrador padding faithfully beside me, and looked across at the decaying structures. They didn't know the lake. They didn't understand its power, its memory. They thought they could impose their will upon it, bend it to their spreadsheets and profit margins. They learned, too late, that the water always has the final say. My land remained untouched, a sanctuary of sanity in a world too often swayed by the glib promises of charlatans. And I, the reluctant warrior, the quiet archivist of their doom, continued to watch, to listen, to remember, knowing the lake held its secrets, and I held mine. The story would become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered whenever a new developer arrived with glossy brochures and grand plans that seemed too good to be true. They would point across my lake to the skeletal remains of waterside estates, and they would remember the rain, the rising water, and the unheeded warnings of the old man who knew the water better than they knew themselves.